agenda here today is focusing on some of the major conceptual stumbling blocks that beginners face when they encounter their first programming language, whether it be Ruby or JavaScript or Python or Java, so application development level languages. All these concepts are very similar across languages, perhaps with a little bit of tweaks here and there, but these are the major stumbling blocks that I see. This is not going to be a tutorial on Ruby. It's not going to be an introduction to programming. If you are brand new to programming and haven't coded, haven't tried to solve any exercises, you should probably start at our open bookshelf and our free prep course, which will walk you through the steps. After you do that, you'll run into some of these problems we're going to talk about today. And the idea here is that we're going to consolidate here some of the major stumbling blocks so that you can sort of hopefully see that you've been experiencing this, and here's sort of a cheat sheet of problems and how to think about them and how to play around with these problems on your own in IRB or in a code editor. So one of the first, I'll just get started right away. And again, if you have any questions, we'll keep this pretty informal. Any questions, just ask. I might have a chance to answer them. And if not, I'll save it for the end. I made a big outline here, and I don't think we're going to get through any of these. I think we'll only have time to do this part today, lines 7 through 11. We'll see how people enjoy this. If people like it, we'll continue to do more of these sessions, whether on a weekly basis or bi-weekly basis, we'll have to see. But the idea is to go through this outline and also get other questions answered, and perhaps even to solve some random little exercises just to show sort of the debugging process or the thought process of working through problems. So the first problem that I see a lot is with people having a hard time reading Ruby's syntax, because Ruby's syntax has a lot of what they call syntactical sugar, which means that in order to make Ruby appear more expressive and more English-like, it hides a lot of the fundamental or underlying mechanism. Something will look like an operator, but is actually, in fact, a method call. There will be a word there that's a little bit ambiguous, and it could mean multiple things. For example, it could be a local variable, or it could be a method call, and you're not sure what it is. And so these things sort of allow us to write Ruby or read Ruby in a very expressive way, but as programmers, we have to sort of pay attention to exactly what's happening. So I'll try to talk about some of these. So the first thing I'll just say something like this. If I say puts hello, and I'm going to switch over to my editor, and if I run that file, the example.rb file, you can see that it outputs hello. Even this code is a little cryptic because you're unsure where this code came from, right? And that's sort of the second agenda point. Where did this puts come from? So we'll talk about that as well. And then we'll talk about variable scope, specifically local variable scope. So in Ruby, there's a lot of different types of variables. And what I see is people sort of not understanding variable scoping rules, therefore they immediately reach for global variables or instance variables in completely the incorrect context, but your script happens to work, so good enough. So it's important to recognize local variable scoping rules, or all types of variables, but especially local variables, and understand it well enough so that you can code with intention as opposed to the hack and slash method. All right, I'll talk about that a little bit. I think hack and slash is necessary in the beginning stages to kind of keep the motivation and tinkering attitude up. At some point, though, you have to take it to another level, which is coding with intention, understanding what's happening well enough so that you're not randomly moving code around or switching to global variables just to make your script work because you don't know how to work with local variables. The fourth thing we'll talk about if we have time is this idea of pass by reference versus pass by value. Major point of confusion working with not just Ruby, but any language Python, Java, JavaScript. This is a concept that is fundamental to allowing you to craft code according to what you're trying to do, as opposed to, again, typing on the keyboard until you get something to work, but you're not sure why or how, and then moving forward. So these two concepts, local variable scope and passing by value or reference, understanding these two is critical. There's a related concept called variables as pointers. I'll mention it when we get there, but probably won't spend too much time talking about it. And then lastly, we'll save some questions. I got a question here about, can you talk about self? Okay, I'll talk about that with regards to the syntactical sugar. Right, so here's a question that I got about self. Let me think about this. So I won't talk about it too much because it requires OO knowledge, but I'll briefly mention it. You got to go one step at a time, right? The learning sequence is quite difficult. If you're really interested, we have a book called On Object-Oriented Programming. There's a section in there on self. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is that in Ruby, method invocation, the parentheses are optional. So if we look at this code, do you guys know what this code is? Like, what would we describe, how would we describe this code? This is a method invocation, right? That's how I would describe it. But unlike other languages, in Ruby, the parentheses are optional. So here, this may look a little bit more easier sort of to tell what's going on. This is a method invocation, right? And you're passing in a string as an argument to this method. So that's the first thing that's confusing. So if we see something like this, like str, just out in space, we're unsure what is going to happen. Now in this script, it's the first on line 1, so we're pretty sure we know what it is. But if there's a lot of code up here, right? Lots of code up here, and down here we see this, especially if we try to output it, right? If we say print str, we don't know what that is. It could be two things. It could be a variable, right? In this case, it's pretty obvious that line 6 is going to output this string. Or it could be a method, right? If I output that, you see that also works. So looking at line 8 here, it's really unclear what's happening here. Is it a reference to a local variable, or is it a method invocation? In this instance, in this example now, we are printing out the return value of the method invocation. We're printing out the return value of the method invocation. In this example, we're printing out the value of the str variable, right? And Ruby doesn't help us. So if we really wanted to invoke a method, like suppose we have both, so I don't have to keep erasing here. All right, in this case, it is going to reference the local variable and ignore the method. All right, in fact, what I'll do is I'll comment this out, and you'll see the error message that Ruby gives us. All right, this is an error message that you should have seen lots and lots of times. So undefined local variable or method. This error message should tell you that even Ruby doesn't know. It doesn't know what you're trying to do here. Are you trying to reference a local variable or invoke a method? It's telling you it doesn't know. If you have both, it is going to reference the local variable. If I get rid of the local variable, it's going to call the method. But if I wanted to invoke the method when I have both a local variable and a method, I put in parentheses, which is what most other languages do. If you've seen other languages, most of the time, when you invoke a method, you have to put in parentheses. In Ruby, it's optional. So this is great. This is really, really nice and pretty syntax, but it's confusing. So if I do this, then now Ruby will invoke the method, right? In fact, if I get rid of the method and I leave line 10 here, it's not going to go back and reference the local variable because I have parentheses. Ruby will actually give me a much better error message, and it'll say undefined method str. Now, compare it with the previous error message. Previously, Ruby is confused. Undefined local variable or method. It doesn't know what you're trying to do. This bottom error message says undefined method. It knows exactly what you're trying to do. You're trying to invoke a method called str. Doesn't exist, right? And by the way, this is really this, right? Two method calls here. So this type of syntax versus this type of syntax, you can see that without the parentheses, if you like Ruby, you will say that line 12 reads better, is cleaner, gives us a more expressive syntax, reads more like English, right? But I would argue line 10 is actually more clear if you're a programmer and you're trying to debug, right? For example, if I see this code, I will, let's say, for example, parentheses are mandatory when you're trying to invoke a method. If you see this code on line 10, you can be certain that it is referencing a local variable. But in Ruby, we're uncertain, right, what that is. So it's very, very important that you sort of pay attention to this and understand it. Again, reading Ruby's syntactical sugar, right? Super, super important to keep in mind. Now, one of the major issues that I see is that people forget that parentheses are optional when we're invoking a method. And even line 12, it's confusing what's happening. Just keep that in mind. Got a question here. Is a variable inside a method local and outside global? No, that's not. So line 3 is a local variable. Global variables start with a $sign. We have a section in our book called Types of Variables. This is, if you go to launchschool.com/books/Ruby. In the variables chapter, there's different types of variables. I would say for now, don't use any other type of variables except for local variables. So global variables have a $sign. Local variables have different scope. I'll talk about that in a second. But right now, I'm just talking about the fact how confusing it is to read code when method invocations have optional parentheses. Does a variable always take present or method if you don't use parentheses? Yes. So if you have line 10 here, or sorry, if you have line 10 here, and you have a method definition, and you have a local variable, the local variable is going to be referenced when you just specify the keyword or the bare word str. Now, I don't want to say this is bad. Some people say this is good because when you're referencing str, you may not care if it's a local variable or method, right? You just want this, like name. I just want the name. I don't really care about how I get it, if it's a variable or a method. And so in that way, hey, maybe it's a bonus because I can change the implementation of how this name is retrieved, whether it's through a local variable or through a method, without having to change line 10. So you can always kind of flip it back around and say it's a plus. Whether you think of it as a negative or a plus is, I think, irrelevant. It's just that you have to be hyper aware of this feature of Ruby, right? And the ambiguous nature of referencing a local variable versus invoking a method. All right, we're going to get into OO a little bit. So the point here is not to teach OO. If you haven't got into object-oriented programming Ruby yet, perfectly okay. The point here is to show that Ruby gives us a lot of syntactical sugar. And there is a consistent underlying mental model at work here. It is your job to sort of unveil that mental model or load the mental model into your head eventually, right? So don't get too caught up by the syntactical sugar of Ruby. Understand the underlying mechanism. All right, so I'm going to just give an example here of, again, I don't want you to get too caught up on what @accessor is or anything like that. The important concept here is this. I'm going to instantiate a new Bob object, or person object, sorry. And I'm going to say that's going to output Bob. if you read this and you don't know object-oriented programming, this will read very naturally. This is the beauty of Ruby. This is why people like it, right? There's not a lot of keywords and random. I don't know if you guys ever seen Java code before. It's like the opposite philosophy of Ruby. It has all these different keywords, but they do it for a reason. It gives you a lot of context. Here, line 5 and line 6 look very similar. They both look like assignment. However, only one of them is real assignment. So Bob is a local variable, just like str from before. Bob is a local variable, except instead of being a string object, it's a person object. Line 6 is not assignment. This almost looks like, you might think, okay, if you didn't know Ruby very well, you might think, okay, this is maybe some sort of local variable, attached to Bob, the local variable, somehow a local variable within a local variable, namespace or something like that, right, getting assigned. That's not the case at all. It is actually invoking a method on Bob. It is invoking a method. The method is name equals. So the method can look like this. And this is just, again, the syntactical sugar of Ruby. When you have a instance method inside a class that looks like this, Ruby allows you to call it with a space syntax. It looks better. That's why it allows you to do that. But if you don't understand that, it's impossible to decipher this code. It looks like assignment, but it's not assignment. It's a method invocation. Right? In fact, I can get rid of this, and I'll run this code. Notice the error message. Undefined method, name equals. Right? Undefined method, you're like, name equals, where am I calling the name equals method? Right? There's a couple of things weird here. That first of all, in Ruby, you can have a method that ends with the equal sign, right? That's kind of odd. But the second thing that's kind of really odd is that we don't invoke it like a normal method, right? We have this special syntax, which makes it really confusing. All right. So you don't have to worry about this. The point is syntactical sugar of Ruby, right? Makes reading code really, really difficult if you don't understand the language very well. Okay, I got a few more questions here. Does one of the books go in depth on syntactical sugar? It is throughout the book. It is throughout the books, I should say. Would you have to know all Ruby methods? That's like saying, would you have to know all the words in the English language? The answer is obviously no. And which words should you know? It's going to come from practice, and it's going to come from, coding a lot, right? An important thing is to be able to look up the methods as you need them. I would definitely encourage you to study a couple of important classes, especially collections, but this is just going to come with time, right? If somebody was trying to learn English and it says, which grammar rules or words should I memorize? All of them? You would say, here's a small list, start from there, but, expand out over time, right? That's kind of the same philosophy here. Last example I'll give, this is a little confusing, but just to show you how sort of confusing Ruby can be if you don't understand it. Let's say Jim's name is Jim, and I want to do something like this. Bob is greater than Jim. Does that make sense to do that? Let's say age instead of name. Age is 30. Jim, age is 50. And I want to say, is Bob greater than Jim? Right, that's what I'm asking here. Is Bob greater than Jim? And I want this comparison to use its age. So in this case, it should print false. Right, I'm expecting it to print false. So I get a couple errors. Well, the first error I get is no name equals, right? Just like before. All right, I'm going to define age equals method. And I'll say age equals A. This is an instance variable. Don't worry about it if you don't know what that is yet. Just know that we're keeping track of the age inside each of these objects, Bob and Jim. Now look at the error message. Undefined method greater than for person, right? So the first error message is undefined method age equals. Second error message says undefined greater than. Undefined greater than for person. This tells you that this operator here, if I didn't know Ruby, I would have said this makes no sense, right? Like 2 is greater than 1, and maybe you can say the string A is greater than the string B. But to say Bob is greater than Jim, or is Bob greater than Jim, that's just an invalid question, right? In Ruby, we can actually define a greater than method in the class, and we can say self.age greater than other.age. I'm going to need this getter method here. And I get false. So this means that line 21 there looks like it's like using an operator that's built into the language. In fact, it's invoking this method on line 10. Okay, we call this fake operators. And I can change the implementation of this and just say hi there on line 21. Now it's going to say hi there, which makes no sense whatsoever. But this is, again, the problem with the syntactical sugar that you'll encounter when you're reading Ruby code. This line 21, is really like this, right? First of all, it's a method invocation. Second of all, this is another method invocation. Right? Do you see that? Bob is calling the greater than method, passing in Jim. And the result of that is being passed in to the P method. So deciphering Ruby code is really difficult if you don't understand the language well. So if I say, compare line 21 with line 23, this is almost like night and day. Right? But if you didn't know that it actually looks like line 23, and somebody says there's an error here, go fix it, you don't stand a chance of even starting to, where should I look to fix this bug, right? It should not print out hi there. It should return true or false. All right, getting a couple more questions here. What IDE do you recommend for beginners? I recommend Sublime Text. It's not an IDE, it's a text editor. If you come from a language that relies on IDEs, you'll find that most Rubyists do not use an IDE, although you can, but most Rubyists do not. Sublime is free for trial. It's very fast, and it's cross-platform. There's another editor called Atom. I hate to keep harping on this, but if you follow the prep materials, it'll walk you through all this. Don't worry about OO programming or things like that. I think the point I want to drive home is this. When you read Ruby code, when you're trying to follow a tutorial, when you're trying to learn an advanced framework, you can copy and paste your way to seemingly a functioning application or program without understanding anything. Because Ruby has such a great syntax when you read it. It's so pretty and beautiful and succinct. However, there's a lot of depth behind the scenes. So if you don't understand that depth, copy and pasting as far as you can go. Would you say it's completely normal or would you say it's normal for a beginner to not completely understand a code? Especially have this problem with array and hash iterators. I would say that's very normal, but I would say don't let that fuzziness go, right? It depends on what, but in your example, you're talking about array and hash iterators. It's on the list of very important things that you must understand, especially like map and select. I wouldn't let that fuzziness go, right? So this is the hard part with sort of giving advice to beginners, because I would give different advice to different people. So if you're very early in the process, you kind of don't have to worry about this yet. If you're sort of never coded before and you're just starting your journey, I would say just tinker around, use global variables, hack and slash. It's okay. Play with the code. I think what you encounter is that, get some excitement, but what you encounter is that as you're hacking and slashing and you're just going crazy and tinkering, over time, you'll start to want naturally to bring some structure to the chaos. You'll start to feel this is really chaotic. I'm just spraying global variables all over the place and I don't really understand what's happening, but I seem to be able to, get some joy out of seeing some working program. That's good. But over time, you're going to want to bring more structure to the way you code. And that is going to require studying some fundamental aspects of the language, like I'm showing here. Right? And the more serious you get, the more structure and fundamental understanding of language you'll want to have. Right? That's why in our program, we're very serious about this. By the way, everything on this list you have to know before you pass the first course. Right? And we have like 15, 20 courses. And why is that? Well, because we want to produce people who are very serious about code. So again, very early in the process, I think it's natural. It's okay to, play with it. You don't have to read the rules, best practices, get bogged down with all these details yet. But once you find that you enjoy programming and, you've been writing a handful of scripts that sort of are very, very chaotic and, when you come back to it a couple of days later, you have no idea what's going on. That's when, take the next step in terms of studying and understanding the language better. All right, so we're definitely not going to get very far today. It's already 30 minutes in, and I think I've only talked about the first one. The second point here is, where does code come from? So people are very, very confused about what can I call? What can I not call? The example I gave earlier is puts hello. So that allows me to output something to the standard out. Where did that come from? Why can I call puts? It's built into Ruby, sure, but what are the other methods I can call? And where do they live? And what's the organization? Is there just 5,000 methods or whatever, 500 methods floating around somewhere that I can invoke at any point in time? Understanding sort of, this is RubyDoc. This is official documentation for the Ruby language. There's sort of two main parts to Ruby. One is called the core API. One is called the standard API. I'm going to open up the standard API in a separate tab here. The core API is what is loaded into, you can think of the Ruby runtime, that allow you to invoke methods. And these methods aren't just all laid out, 500 of them. They're actually organized into classes or modules. And again, classes and modules, what are those? Well, we'll get into it, right? We'll get into in object-oriented programming, but for now, you can think of them as ways to organize our methods. Right? One of them is called kernel, and just as the word kernel implies, this is core, right? This is one of the most important modules in the Ruby language. And if you look at the methods in kernel, one of them is puts. So the puts method is actually, it lives inside of kernel. So you can almost do this. Right, so you're invoking the kernel method puts, right? But again, kernel gets loaded everywhere, so we can remove that, remove the caller of the method. That's another topic we'll cover some other time. And then we can remove the optional parentheses, so we can just say puts hello. And all the methods in the core classes can be invoked without any additional code. It's just available to you, like hashes, arrays, strings. These are all classes and methods that are available to us without doing anything extra. They're part of the language, right? We can work with arrays, and all these methods on arrays are available to us. However, there is another sort of set of libraries or classes that comes with Ruby, but is not automatically loaded for you. And why is it not automatically loaded for you? Well, just because we don't want the language to bloat. They're used less frequently, right? So if you just take a quick glance down here, processing CSV files, we don't use them very often. We don't need to have that always loaded. I'm going to choose a simple one here that deals with prime. So suppose I want to write a method that tells me whether a range of numbers is prime or not. So I'll say, for example, the numbers 1 through 5, which of them are prime, right? Actually, I'm going to, so I'll just code that up real quick. I'm going to call a method called isPrime, which I have not written yet, right? I'm going to define this method called isPrime. Again, this is optional. If you see this, right, looks like that, it's fine. Okay, so I'm going to write a method called isPrime. Now the question is, how do I calculate whether or not num is prime? Ruby gives us a method called prime. There's a manual we can calculate for sure. I'm going to not do that, right? I'm just saying, is num prime? Okay, so you can see that in my custom method isPrime, there's an undefined method prime question mark for fixed num. And this is because the prime question mark method is in the standard library, not in the core library, which means I have to require it. I think it's just called prime. Right? And now, okay, I think that worked. I didn't print it out, so I'll print it out now. So you can see that the prime question mark method that I invoked on line 4 is all of a sudden it comes to life somehow. Somehow this method exists. Previously it didn't. And this is because prime is, it requires loading for me to use it. I have to load this file or library for me to use it because it's part of the standard library, not the core library. So everything in the core library is automatically loaded. Things in the standard library are not. Okay, so remember, this is the topic of where does the code come from. So first core library, then standard library with a require. The next possible place that some code can come from is a library, an external library or gem, right, that somebody else wrote, or maybe you wrote. One is called pry, right? If you haven't used this before, I highly suggest you do. So when we code as Ruby developers, we tend to use a lot of external libraries that does not come with the core or standard libraries of Ruby. Or maybe it augments or replaces a library in the core standard library that we think is better. You know, somebody else wrote it in a better way, perhaps. So it's pretty common for us, for any Ruby developer, to have lots of what we call gems, which is basically Ruby libraries, external libraries. And one of them is called pry. So in order to use it, I have to say require pry, right? And then binding pry. If I put a binding pry, it'll stop execution there. So this is a really useful gem because, whoops, you can see that it stops execution there, allowing me to inspect all the variables at that point in time. Okay, but the key concept here is like, where did this come from? Binding pry. It came from this pry library. Well, where did that come from? It came from the pry gem. How did you know it came from the pry gem as opposed to the standard library? That's just something you have to be aware of. Lots of places where code can come from, right? Just without even talking about custom code that you wrote. This is just core library, standard library, external libraries. Suppose we have our own code. This is pretty common, right? If let's say we have, let's say we're writing a bookstore application, right? And I can say it's a bookstore, and I want to run this code inside my example. I could say require relative and the file name. without the RB. And you can see that I ran the other code. Usually you probably wouldn't want to do this. Usually it's right. Usually you're loading some sort of class, and then here oops, Bob, and then you can say pbob.name. Right? So in the example.rb file that I'm working in, I somehow have access to this person class. And suppose, my code is way down here. There's a lot of code in between. I don't see line 1. It can appear kind of magical, like where did this come from, right? Well, it came from bookstore. So in a larger code base, this can get really confusing. And by the way, we didn't even talk about subclassing and mixing in modules. So if you're in a large library like Rails, it's just so confusing on where that particular method came from, because you're loading a lot of different files in. These files contain a lot of classes. These classes will subclass from multiple superclasses. These superclasses will then mix in a handful of modules each. It's very, very, very confusing. But just know that it comes from somewhere. The magic of frameworks or libraries is there's some reasoning behind it. All right, but that's not the end of the story here. In Ruby, there's a thing called metaprogramming, which means that we can modify the code at runtime. And a lot of people use this to dynamically create methods when your application is running. So you don't even know where the method is, and it doesn't exist. You can't even find the method in your code base because it's dynamically created at runtime. Adds another layer of complexity as far as where does my code come from. Okay, so again, I don't want you to kind of get hung up on objects or classes or gems or how to use pride. That's not the point. The point is that there's always an answer to where does the code come from. And again, if you read tutorials and blog entries, it's copy paste. I don't know where it comes from, but I got a blog up, right? Taking the time to understand Ruby well is going to serve you much better, and just know that there is a consistent mental model of where the code comes from. However, the story is not, it can get complex, right? And it's your job to understand that complexity to some degree. There's depth to sort of every single one of these questions. You may know a little bit here, but as you learn more, you'll understand it better and deeper. And same thing with this, right? Like we don't touch metaprogramming until in our advanced phase. The full answer to this question is really not even going to be uncovered until much, much later. Where did pride come from again? It came from the gem. So I had a gem. A gem is just a library in Ruby that I installed. So somebody created it out in the world. And they said, I created this thing called pry. It's pretty cool. Do you want to use it? You said, yeah, I want to use it. Gem install pry on your system. Download it on your machine. And then in order to use it in your library, you say require pry. Local variable scope. Okay, so all clear? So the point here is to show you how confusing even simple Ruby code is. In other words, Ruby is an easy language to digest, but there's a lot of complexity behind it. It's not so simple to understand. I'll give you an example. If every single method call require parentheses, that would be simpler. It would look uglier. The code may look more complex, right? You'd have code that looks like this, perhaps. So it looks more complex, but it's a much simpler mental model to work with, right? Whereas if you took away your parentheses, it seems easier in that there's not a lot of extra parentheses and keywords, but there's more complexity behind it. So the price we pay for a great, seemingly easy syntax is that we have to understand the complexity behind the scenes. Oh, this is a good question. Do you have any questions? Do you have any suggestions for using RI to learn about concepts on the fly? I don't use RI myself, but I know a lot of people who do. So obviously, from my perspective, it's not a mandatory tool, but you can. I would definitely say get used to learn, like just going here, Ruby docs. Same thing, right? You can use a search here, or you can just search online, but try to go to Ruby docs and read it and get used to it. There's a part in our book that is all about reading, I think in preparations, reading documentation. So in our book, there's a section on how to read the documentation in Ruby docs. Right, kind of takes apart the different parts of the documentation. Okay, so local variable scope. Let's write a method that is going to, let's say we have an array. We're going to write a method that is going to sum up the elements in the array. I know there's a method called reduce or inject that we can do this in one step. It's okay if you don't know it. We're not going to use that method. We're just going to loop through this particular array. So you can use a loop. You can use an iterator. This is an iterator. I'm just going to prefer a simple loop. So this is an infinite loop right now. So I need a break. Whenever you write a loop, you want to break under a certain condition. So if so we need a counter. We'll start the counter at 0. And we need a sum. Sum starts at 0. And what we'll say is sum plus equals array at the index of the counter, right? So the first time through, counter is 0. Array 0 is going to return the value 1. Sum is going to be 0, so plus or equal 1. And we have to increment the counter. Right? Then we increment the counter. Does the counter equal to size? No. Actually, it has to be size minus 1. This is what happens when you don't have prepared code. I'm just coding on the fly here. Always dangerous. So counter is at this point going to be equal to 1. Array size, I did minus 1 here because counter starts at 0. Right? So there's 4 elements, but counters we want to stop when the counter reaches 3. Your total is sum. Let's see if this works. Okay, great. All right. So the point of this is to show the scope of local variables. I use 2 local variables here. Or actually 3. I use 3 local variables here, right? And if you aren't familiar with local variable scope, even writing a simple code like this, which took, a minute or two, a couple of minutes, right? You can get stumped here because you're not sure if a local variable initialized here, first of all, is it accessible in here? And this is reassignment, right? I'm reassigning sum and I'm reassigning counter. Is it accessible in here? And then finally, is it accessible again out here? Right? Local variable scoping rules. Very, very important. So to summarize, the answer is yes, obviously it works. But the reason why it works is because loop do in here constitutes a block. And local variables initialized out here is accessible in an inner block, inner scope within a block. However, if I have a new variable initialized inside the inner block, inner scope, it's not accessible in an outer scope. Undefined local variable or method new var. Okay, I'll clean this code up a little bit. I showed this example only to show how often we use this construct without maybe thinking about the local variable scope rules. Maybe I'll just comment it out so we can have it there. So the idea is that we have and right, so we have a block here. The question is, can we access this str variable on line 21? The answer is yes. Hello, because str is initialized on line 18. Now the question is, what is going to be the output of line 25? We've reassigned line 21 here, str, right? The local variable. Is that going to be a persistent reassignment? We already saw from the example up here that the answer is yes, because the plus equals is basically a reassignment, a shortcut for reassignment, right? So line 25, we should expect the output to be world, right? Now, if I comment out line 18, you'll notice that line 21 becomes variable initialization. We get an error, undefined local variable or method str. So this goes back to the first point, reading Ruby. This is not syntactical sugar, but this is really reading Ruby code. This is the difficult part of reading Ruby code. If I uncomment line 18, line 21 becomes reassignment. If I comment out line 18, line 21 becomes initialization. That change in the context of this line 21 is very non-obvious because there's no differentiating syntax between variable initialization versus variable reassignment. In a lot of languages, we'll be forced to, specify a keyword or something when we're doing initialization, right? Some sort of keyword. But in Ruby, there's no keyword. Variable reassignment and variable initialization look the same. And in fact, line 25, you can look at this code and say, yeah, that ain't going to work because line 21 is where we initialize the method. You can understand all this really well and understand that. But what if way up here we had a def, right? Just kind of hidden. And line 29 would still work because it becomes a method invocation. No longer worried about where you're here paying attention to where the local variable is initialized. Line 29 will still execute now. They'll say hi because there's a method invocation way up here, out of sight. So what's the point of this? First of all, understanding local variable scoping rules. Really, really important. Second of all, combining local variable scoping rules with another concept, like remembering that this bare word here could be a local variable or a method invocation, can quickly become very, very confusing. Now, we're not even in the world of OO yet, where your methods can be inherited from a lot of different places. This right here is what makes programming hard. It's not copy and pasting to build a Twitter clone. It's being able to read code like this and being able to think about, okay, what could str be here? Is this accessible here? Is this code going to execute here on line 29? Looks like no. Actually, yes. Right? Oh, I got a question. Isn't the scope size incorrect since it should be 10? Oh, good call. Is there an error here? Let's fix that. So I'll do that as the last thing here. So you're saying the total should not be 6. And define like a new var. Break if counter is equal to array. Okay, so it should be array.size. Right. Your total is 10. Yeah, you're right. Sorry about that. I didn't prepare this code, so I just kind of coded it up on file. Off by one error. Very common error as well. I think I'll stop here. I didn't get the chance to talk about pass by reference or pass by value. I'll talk about that next. I got a handful of collection-oriented questions. Maybe we can talk about that next time since there's so much, so many questions about it. If you're in our program, there's, you don't have to wait till next session. You can ask, whether it's in the forums or in the specific lesson forums or in the general forums. So, you don't have to wait till next time. Any other questions? Any other thoughts? Was this helpful? I guess I wasn't, I was hoping to go a little bit faster, but the funny thing is initially I made this giant outline and I thought I could get maybe halfway done. And then I thought, well, no, probably not. So let's pick sort of the 4 things I want to talk about today, and I didn't even get through that. All right, so hopefully, I guess the main thing is if you're brand new, if you're new in the process, you can see how important it is to be able to understand what I keep calling sort of the mental model of Ruby. Once you have that, following a tutorial or blog to build, apps or programs is going to be much, much, much easier. But if you only stay at the surface level of building applications without understanding sort of the underlying mechanism of the language, you're always going to be hindered by that lack of knowledge. And you'll always hit sort of walls where you won't be able to fix a problem. Right? So following the happy path of building a blog is going to be joyful, and you're going to get there. As soon as something happens, or you want to add a new feature, or there's a bug, not understanding these things is going to really impair your ability to, fix your code, right? Or build what you want to build. Code with intention, right? So, as you can see, there's actually a lot more I want to talk about. Well, if you guys found this helpful, give me some feedback, either over email is fine. If you found this helpful, we'll continue to do this, again, either weekly or bi-weekly, and we'll knock out all these items on this list, which I think are all very, very useful for people who are starting their journey of learning a program. All right, guys, have a good rest of the day. Thanks again for attending on a Saturday.